Hi, I'm Niall Stanage from The Hill, and you're very welcome to our latest conversation. I'm joined today by Ali Winston and Darwin Bongring. Ali and Darwin are the authors of a new book, The Riders Come Out at Night, Brutality, Corruption and Cover-Up in Oakland. The book tells the story of the Oakland Police Department. And that's a story often marked by brutality and grotesque abuses, but also by steps toward reform. Those steps are sometimes significant, but more often hesitant and halting. Ali, Darwin, welcome. So, thanks for joining us. Ali, I guess the first question to you, just to start us off at the start, who were the Riders?
So the Riders were the name that a group of West Oakland cops gave to themselves in the late 1990s, or turn of the millennium, 2000. They were part of a hard-charging set of officers who were pursuing a very aggressive clean up the streets, anti-narcotics, and zero tolerance NYPD-style policing strategy implemented by Mayor Jerry Brown in the late night after he won the mayoralty of Oakland in the start of what would become his political comeback. So the Riders were the four people charged criminally for their acts were Clarence Mabadag, Chuck, Matthew Hornung, Jude Siapno, and Frank Vasquez. They were outed by a young officer named Keith Batt, a rookie who rode along with these cops during his first and only 2 weeks as an Oakland police officer. And he witnessed some egregious abuses and crimes while on duty, framing suspects, shooting a dog, planting narcotics on people, beating confessions out of them. It was pepper spraying them in the mouth, beating people on the sole of their feet with a baton till they couldn't walk. If you've ever seen the film Training Day, this is a contemporary scandal to the underlying events that underpin Training Day, the Rampart scandal in Los Angeles, except it happened up I-5 in Northern California, in Oakland.
And in relation to the Riders, as you mentioned, the rookie cop Keith Batt shows really extraordinary courage, in my view at least, in coming forward with these abuses. These abuses come to light, and everyone is understandably shocked and outraged by that. But Darwin, if I could go to you, I mean, in a way, the exposure of the Riders, it's not remotely close to the end of the story. It's the beginning of the story in some ways, because what the book then goes on to trace is how difficult police reform actually is and how it runs into all kinds of resistance.
Yeah, that's right. The Riders scandal is like an inflection point. Of course, before the year 2000, there were police abuses in Oakland. Going all the way back, we trace them back historically into the 1800s, but there were abuses in the 1950s, 1960s. There were many attempts to fix policing to make it constitutional from the 1950s through the 1990s. What happens with the Riders that's different is finally someone from within the department comes forward with allegations that just simply cannot be explained away. They can't be covered up. And by that time, American jurisprudence, if you will, has developed this mechanism for reforming policing in America called the consent decree. And so the federal government is going into cities and forcing police departments to reform themselves through this legal mechanism, essentially a settlement agreement. What happens in Oakland is a little bit different. Two civil rights attorneys come in and they bring about a consent decree with the agreement of the city there. And yeah, that's really the core of the story that we're tracing, is then the next 20 years following the imposition of this consent decree in Oakland, this negotiated settlement agreement that spells out, 52, complicated tasks to fix policing in the city of Oakland. So from about, 2003, when the consent decree was signed, to the present, it's this long story of making some progress, making some changes, some backsliding, some intransigence by people within the police department to resist reforms, frustrations, scandals bubbling forth. It's a really complicated story. And you're right, in telling the story of trying to reform a police department, we're showing just how extremely difficult it is to transform policing and transform police culture in the United States. Years ago, if an Oakland police officer was chasing someone on foot, they were encouraged by their sergeants and the other command staff in the department to catch that person, whatever cost it took. There was sort of this encouragement of an aggressive tactic in these foot chases. These foot chases frequently led to police officers trapping people in backyards or crawl spaces and shooting them, because that sort of like catch this person at all costs by yourself mentality led to very dangerous explosive situations. Later on, a police chief, Sean Went, he really undid that policy through the negotiated settlement agreement, said, look, you can break off a foot chase at any time and you're not going to be disciplined. And they implemented a whole new policy around chasing people. The goal is not to catch them at all costs. The goal is to catch them safely. And in the end, we saw police officer shootings plummet in Oakland. So who the police chief is has mattered a lot in the city over time.
But Ali, I just wanted to take the broader, so to speak, 30,000-foot view of this. One of the things that struck me reading the book was just how Oakland is. There are so many sort of factors or strands in American life that come together there and come together in the story that you're telling, and it's a story that's broader than policing. I mean, you look through the history of Oakland and you see, white flight, or the problems of poverty, or the rise of the Black Panthers in the 60s. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale are figures in this book. Bobby Seale running for mayor of Oakland at one point and getting well over 40,000 votes, if I remember correctly. And then, closer to the present day, we have the Occupy movement, the killing of Oscar Grant, which of course, became more prominent in the wake of the Fruitvale Station movie. It is remarkable, isn't it, how many of these strands are present in this story of the city that you're writing about?
I would agree with that. I think that in many ways, Oakland is, so there's an adage you'll have to forgive me this little regression. I studied history as an undergraduate, and in American history, there's a little bit of a trope whereby California has kind of been the leading edge of historical developments in the country, and Oakland certainly fits that archetype. It's a port city. It's a very mixed up city. The racial balance is remarkably diverse and has been since, I think, the 1980s. At one point during the writing of our book, it was 30% African American, about 30% white, 25% Latino, and 10% Asian. And there are very few cities around the country that have that balance. It's one of the first places that African Americans kind of had the majority in the city council and the mayoralty by the mid 1970s. But at the same time, it's a pretty blue collar town, excuse me. And in a lot of respects, the social movements and social currents that have run through the country's history are very present in Oakland. We see the Palmer raids from the late 1910s and early 1920s. A lot of the post-World War I labor and social unrest was very present there. So was by coincidence or not coincidence, the rise of the modern Ku Klux Klan on the West Coast. There was a huge Klan presence in Oakland, kind of white Protestant backlash to Catholic immigrants and, later, and Chinese immigrants as well, settling in Oakland. The African American population came to Oakland. The majority came during the Great Migration as well, it's not the Great Migration, the Second World War's labor migration, which also reflects a similar movement of people up to the Northeast and into the Southwest as well, Los Angeles in particular, Arizona as well. And in a sense, Oakland really does, it's a very typical American city. Most American cities are several hundred thousand people large. They're not New York or Los Angeles. They have, a mix of suburban and urban, fabric as well, which Oakland does. I think that one of the ways in which this city is so unique is that it's very progressive politically, and it has gotten more and more so since about the 1960s. It wasn't always that way. It was relatively staid and conservative, especially by comparison to San Francisco in the mid 20th century. But since then, it really has developed a reputation as one of the more progressive places in the country. And in that sense, with regard to policing, it is because of the pushback to police abuses starting in the 1950s and then continuing obviously through the Black Panthers in the 1980s and 1990s, it has been one of the places where there's a broad constituency of residents who are aware of the excesses of police power and want to rein that in. At the same time, it's also a violent city, and it has been a violent city for decades at this point. The biggest jump in violent crime, and we note this in our book, really comes around the time of white flight and also the concurrent rise of the African-American political class in Oakland in the 1970s. And there's also broader dynamics in California that lead to the defunding of cities and school districts and the kind of collapse of the industrial job base that really led to Oakland's prosperity in the mid 20th century. And that's a story that has played itself out many, many times across the country. A similar dynamic also exists with the late 1990s, early 2000s urban renewal in Oakland, which also has led to a pretty large downtown building boom, big increase in the median income as well, but also tremendous homelessness, displacement, gentrification, and a significant outflow of the city's African-American population, which is tied in with other factors as well, but including the consistent and unfortunate persistence of violent crime in those areas and gun violence and just lack of opportunity. But it is a very good size of city to study all these different problems that permeate American society: disinvestment, racial divisions, deindustrialization, income stratification, and law enforcement, which I think many authors, including especially David Simon, have made clear that law enforcement unfortunately has become a Swiss Army knife by which American municipalities and governments and policy actors have tried to address all the ills of society with, I would say, a very checkered record of success.
The issue of police reform or policing generally while crime rates are on the rise is a very vexing issue, and we see it cited again, particularly by conservatives right now, although I know there's some contention around exactly what the crime figures do show. But the charge against reformists is always that you're making the police less effective by proposing these various reforms. One of the more interesting things, and it's a police chief you already mentioned, Sean Went, who was, it seems to me, broadly speaking, more reformist. Actually, he did make considerable progress in fighting crime while also trying to enact some of these reforms. So maybe you could take up that point, that police reform does not necessarily render the police less effective. In fact, it can have the opposite effect.
Yeah, that's right. The story in Oakland is pretty complicated, but there's never really been a good correlation between, rising crime and a political will or movement to reform policing. Those things have coincided at some points in history, but also what's coincided at other points in history has been a law and order politics, which is in the people in power, the mayor, the governor, the local district attorney, and others, they embrace a law and order politics. They pursue that kind of policing and those prosecutions and social policies for many years on end, and crime still continues to go up.
Broadening that out to the national picture, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the chances of police reform, given that there was all that energy around the time of the George Floyd protests? I feel it's generally accepted that a lot of that energy has dissipated. There was, as you know, a congressional effort at fairly modest police reform, which didn't actually pass. So, you know, where are you on that? As someone who I think is quite clearly sympathetic to the cause of reform broadly, where are you on the optimism-pessimism scale?
I think, first of all, I want to make clear that the issue of police reform and making sure that law enforcement has legitimacy is not I think that there are many people within law enforcement who would say that that's actually essential, that you can't have a modern police force that is viewed, as the Panthers basically laid out, as an occupying army by the citizens who pay for that police force and who, you know, its officers are sworn to protect. I think that by and large, the currents in society are very fickle, and they're oftentimes driven by special interest groups, not only law enforcement and their allies within sections of the media and sections of both political parties, but they're also driven by, unfortunately, this like Manichaean culture war that we really have kind of set our society up in as a result of several years of polarization. I do think that the Biden administration has actually been quite aggressive on using the civil rights section and pursuing bad actors in law enforcement. However, the problem is that, as our book shows, and this is actually something that we drive at towards the end, the only way that the current state of affairs improves is if there is relentless external oversight of law enforcement from the communities that really are the constituents for those cities or counties. And that can come in the form of a independent counsel for police misconduct investigations. That can come in the form of a police commission. That can come in the form of independent review boards. That can come in the form of alternatives to law enforcement for mental health mental health problems or for narcotics offenses. And there have been a lot of examples of those initiatives throughout the country. The non-police intervention program in Oakland is just one of them. However, the idea that these programs have to show instant results and have to have a quantifiable result in the short term is setting these programs up for failure, because we don't evaluate law enforcement on those grounds. If we did, then during the 1980s and 1990s, we would have just defunded law enforcement, because they clearly weren't turning in results. Violent crime was spiking, and they weren't getting the results needed to reduce street violence, narcotics related activity, and so forth. Think of all the demands that you put on a street cop. They have to do traffic enforcement. They have to do mental health counseling and assistance. They have to sometimes be an EMT. They have to be a first responder in cases of gun violence, and basically have to engage in, active shooter situations, or they have to engage in physical combat. And then they have to learn how to talk people down in certain situations. That is pushing an individual to you're asking an incredible amount of individuals, let alone the institution. So what we're really trying to do is show that there are efforts to kind of recognize the limits to which law enforcement has been pushed, and maybe reshape the profession away from this very hard-edged, hard-charging, abusive, brutal shape that it took in the 1970s, 80s, and 1990s. I mean, there's a line in our book that we really use to kind of refer back to this in a shorthand, that when Jerry Brown, who was the mayor of Oakland in the 1990s, was campaigning for office, he was campaigning on this very left-wing kind of ecotopian vision of Oakland as this kind of socialist acropolis in the Bay, on the East Bay, and lovely California sun with mild weather and so forth. That was his political campaign. And then he turns back around within a few months of getting in office, and lo and behold, you have Rudy Giuliani West implementing NYPD style zero tolerance tactics in a city which, was getting less violent. Oakland's violent crime rate really did peak in the early 1990s and was starting to decline. But the way in which they were reshaped by a politician to pursue a clean up the streets at all cost method. I mean, that's why they're in the situation that they're in. And I don't think that story is unique. And it's important to recognize that law enforcement has agency and that these institutions are, they have their own ability to determine their course and their politics and their policy. But in a certain sense, they're also tools of politicians and political parties, and how they're used is a conscious decision, and that's something that needs to be had. That's a conversation that needs to be had beyond the field of law enforcement.
You know, in a good year, 4 in 10 people who are murdered in Oakland, the people who murdered them are going free. In a bad year, 7 in 10 or more of the suspects in homicide cases, they're not getting caught, they're not getting prosecuted. And I know for a fact, reading deeply into the investigative records of these cases, probably the main reason a lot of these cases go unsolved is because people don't trust the police. And so at its core, a lot of the reforms that are being pushed are also to try to build trust between the community and the police department, so that the violent crime problem, in particular shootings and homicides, so that the city can make progress on that. Because until people trust the police to police the city constitutionally, then the culture in the community is to not trust the police, to not talk to the police. I've seen, you know, at least half a dozen cases this year alone where witnesses to shootings have declined to tell the police, you know, who the suspects are. People who commit shootings in Oakland is often quite well known who they are. And, you know, Ali and I have seen over the years many cases where the key intelligence to solve a homicide, it comes through a person who has the trust of the community. And these are often the officers who have most embraced some of the reform efforts. I think I just wanted to put that out there because in a sense, that's in Oakland, that's kind of the key, that's sort of the key goal of reform. Because as Ali said earlier, the city has an intense violent crime problem that's like not going to go away. So getting rid of the police is totally unrealistic. So the question is, how do you make the police more effective? And so I think a lot of the reformers see themselves as that being partly their ultimate goal.
Sure. I think that a lot of people understand that complexity, understand the relationship between trust and policing, all of that. I also think that in instances where the violent crime rate is increasing, it often becomes, at least in a political sense, more difficult to make progressive arguments. We're basically out of time. Darwin, I'll maybe just stick with you for one very final question, which was that toward the end of the book, you're talking about the importance of police reform and the difficulty of it, and you refer to how it needs the utmost exertion by civil society in order for these things to work. Do you think that that will exists in the United States right now?
I think in a lot of the places where you see the most intense problems regarding gun violence, drug trafficking, other very serious crimes, I think the people who live in those communities remain deeply committed to the idea of police reform, even though right now the pendulum is swinging a little bit away from where it was 2 years ago when there was intense demand for reform. Policing is not going anywhere. The police as an institution is deeply ingrained in American society. And the same old dynamic of, you know, people on the other side of the debate are also going to remain there. And in a way that tension isn't going anywhere. I don't know that we're seeing anything new right now, except for maybe reform being pushed a little bit further than it has been in the past.
To kind of broaden out from Oakland, when I started my reporting career there in 2008, you could not get records about officer-involved shootings or internal affairs incidents. And there was a huge wall of secrecy that was made up of several components, state laws and state jurisprudence that blocked reporters and the public from learning about officer misconduct histories and some egregious incidences. And you had basically a couple ways into it, through the courts or through intense source-based reporting. Those blocks, those hindrances on public oversight and transparency were actually removed a few years back by the California state legislature, which has been on a very strong reform kick in terms of criminal justice and kind of pulling back some of the restrictions on public insight into the system. There have been different sorts of checks and balances passed for things like the state's gang database, for bail and bond laws, for law enforcement's ability to get certain types of surveillance equipment. There is a broader, subtle movement that's happening in the US, especially in state houses and cities, that is pushing us towards a different type of criminal justice system. It doesn't get the same level as the broad national level debates that can be boiled down to one word here, one word there, one side here, one side there. And I do think that there is a bigger recognition about the need to engage in this sort of shift, this paradigm shift. And it is happening. It's just unfortunately happening incrementally and not in a tight enough cycle to fit into the current media sphere that we're in. So
well, on that point, I think it is a longer conversation. I think it's a fascinating conversation, and I think your book has contributed to it. But I'm afraid we are out of time. So Ali Winston, Darwin Bond-Graham, authors of the new book, "The Riders Come Out at Night: Brutality, Corruption, and Cover-Up in Oakland." Thanks so much for your time, and thanks for joining us at The Hill.
Thanks for the conversation.
thank you so much.